YouTube fails, of course I'll have the Twitch. Okay, hopefully it doesn't fail, but my Twitch streams have been saving with the exception of the first half of my art stream for today, which kind of was a bummer since that was the Santa drawing I made. That was like the core of my art stream from today, and half of it didn't even save. But yeah, everything else has, including my tree art. So I encourage you to check it out, and I will probably be uploading that to YouTube as well for later reference. Okay, similar to the other episodes of this series, I will go ahead and read through the 9 recap, and then we'll dive into chapter 10. Okay, so here's the recap. Yeah, YouTube still is down. The breakdown of and this is from litcharts.com. Colonel Haroneldo Marquez can see how empty the war is through his telegraphic conversations with Colonel Aureliano Buendia. As time passes, he can no longer identify the content from Colonel Aureliano Buendia, and he begins to see him as a stranger. He spends time watching Amaranta sew in silence. He brings her a prayer book as a gift, and she notes the irony. She does not love him, but she knows she cannot live without him. When Amaranta turns down Colonel Haroneldo Marquez for good, he has a call with Colonel Aureliano Buendia and tells him it's raining in Macondo. Colonel Aureliano Buendia returns home disinterested in the war. He naps and consorts with his mistresses and little else. Colonel Aureliano Buendia calls together an assembly of the rebel commanders and is surprised by the variety of individuals that make up the group. General Teofilo Vargas stands out from the others. He's an Indian with brutal intentions, and the others recognize him as a threat that must be killed. Colonel Aureliano Buendia won't order such a command, but 2 weeks later the Indian is ambushed by a group of men with machetes. Colonel Aureliano Buendia assumes power. He orders the death of the man who suggested killing General Teofilo Vargas and feels an immense solitude in his position of power. Colonel Aureliano Buendia bristles at the way war has become normalized. Commission from the Liberal Party arrives to discuss the stalemate, and they request 3 concessions: the renunciation of property titles, the renunciation of the fight against the clerics, and the renunciation of equal rights of illegitimate children. Colonel Aureliano Buendia determines then that they would only be fighting for meaningless power. Despite the protests of his political advisor, Colonel Aureliano Buendia signs. Colonel Haroneldo Marquez calls the act of betrayal, and Colonel Aureliano Buendia tells him to surrender his weapons and put himself in the disposition of the Revolutionary Court. Colonel Haroneldo Marquez is sentenced to death for high treason. Ursula tells her son that if he allows Marquez to be shot, she will kill her son with her bare hands. Colonel Aureliano Buendia goes to his friend's cell and releases him so that they can find a more satisfactory agreement to end the war. It takes over 2 years, but as an armistice approaches, Colonel Aureliano Buendia returns home. Ursula does not believe that they will have him home for long, assuming that if the war doesn't take him, death will. Jose Arcadio Segundo and Aureliano Segundo operate as mirrors of each other. Remedios Savidi wanders the house naked. Colonel Aureliano Buendia looks at his mother and all that she has gone through in her life, but feels no pity for her, having been completely desensitized by the war. He thinks of his wife, but the memory is hazy enough that he might remember her as his daughter instead of his wife. He strips the house of his personal belongings, but Ursula stops him when he tries to take down the photo of Remedios. He burns his poetry in the oven of the bakery. So Ursula is trying to preserve the past. Colonel Aureliano Buendia is trying to erase it because he's forgetting. He's been so long on the battlefield that he's forgetting everything else. Pilar Tenera visits Colonel Aureliano Buendia, and he's surprised at how old she is. They've had a son together, Aureliano Jose. Again, we don't know where he is. Last we saw or heard from him, he was trying to have sex with his aunt. And that was like 2 chapters ago. On the fated morning, he joins the troops to finally surrender. Ursula bars the door behind him, intent on hiding away for the rest of her life. Searches the house for memories of her son to no success. Colonel Aureliano Buendia signs the surrender without ceremony. He goes to his tent and shoots himself in the chest. At the same moment, Ursula takes the cover off a pot of milk to check to see if it is boiling, and sees it is full of worms. Sure, this is a sign they have killed her son. She goes out to the courtyard to tell her husband and is still crying there when Colonel Aureliano Buendia is brought home, wrapped in a blanket and alive. I don't know how Ursula would tell her husband since he's already died. What is she gonna do, tell his grave? I don't know, I guessed. The bullet passed cleanly through Colonel Aureliano Buendia's chest without harming any organs. He immediately threatens war against, again, trying to get pensions for the veterans, but the government only adds more guards to prevent him from leaving the house. Ursula puts the guards to work helping around the house, and one, driven crazy by Remedios the Beauty's lack of interest, kills himself in her honor. Very reminiscent of Pietro Crispi's demise. Pietro Crispi, of course, killing himself after Amaranta rebukes him. Or rejects him. Okay, chapter 10. Years later on his deathbed, Aureliano II would remember the rainy afternoon in June when he went into the bedroom to meet his first son. Is he going to be named Aureliano? Aureliano the fourth or fifth, whatever it is now. Even though the child was languid and weepy, with no mark of a Buendia, he did not have to think twice about naming him. And he would be a Buendia, too, because Aureliano II is the grandson. Is he the grandson or great-grandson of Jose Arcadio Buendia? He is the great-grandson. Yes, because his father, Arcadio, was Jose Arcadio Buendia's grandson. So he'd be the great-grandson. And his son would in turn be the great-great-grandson. And yes, a Buendia. We'll call him Jose Arcadio, he said. Wow, I'm just surprised he didn't call him Aureliano. And there already was a Jose Arcadio, as a matter of fact. That was one of Jose Arcadio Buendia's sons. Right, his second son, after Aureliano. Yeah, that was his second son. So he is named after his grandfather. Yeah, again, very, very confusing. Yeah, he is named after his own grandfather. Fernanda del Carpio, the beautiful woman he had married the year before, agreed. Ursula, on the other hand, could not conceal a vague feeling of doubt. Throughout the long history of the family, the insistent repetition of names had made her draw some conclusions that seemed to be certain. She's like, I've lived long enough to know how confusing all of this is. While the Aurelianos were withdrawn, but with lucid minds, the Jose Arcadios were impulsive and enterprising, but they were marked with a tragic sign. I would say that is not entirely the case with Colonel Aureliano Buendia, because as we know, Colonel Aureliano Buendia becomes more enterprising, as we would call it, but through the engagement of his battles and through the wars that he fights. And I also made that observation, I believe, with Aureliano Jose becoming more like an Arcadio. But yeah, I can't quite remember the example in that one. The only cases that were impossible to classify were those of Jose Arcadio II and Aureliano II. They were so much alike and so mischievous during childhood that not even Santa Sofia de la Piedad could tell them apart. And in the previous chapter, chapter 9, we know they're reflecting each other. So they're like reflections of each other. So I'm not sure how that applies to them. On the day of their christening, Amaranta put bracelets on them with their respective names and dressed them in different colored clothing marked with each one's initials. When they began to go to school, they decided to exchange clothing and bracelets and call each other by opposite names. It's like one of those like games that twins will play sometimes to try and confuse people. You can see them in like TikTok sometimes too, where it's like the boy goes up, talks to the cute girl, and then he walks away, and then his brother comes in and talks to her again. She's like, "Whoa, wasn't I just talking to you?" Yes, they're twins. Yes. People cannot teleport. The teacher Melchor Escalona, used to knowing Jose Arcadio Segundo by his green shirt, went out of his mind when he discovered the latter was wearing Aureliano Segundo's bracelet, and that the other one said, nevertheless, that his name was Aureliano Segundo, in spite of the fact that he was wearing the white shirt and the bracelet with Jose Arcadio Segundo's name. From then on, he was never sure who was who. Even when they grew up and life made them different, Ursula still wondered if they themselves might not have made a mistake in some moment of their intricate game of confusion and have become changed forever. Like they actually become the other one. Until the beginning of adolescence, they were two synchronized machines. They would wake up at the same time, have the urge to go to the bathroom at the same time, suffer the same upsets in health, and they even dreamed about the same things. In the house, where it was thought that they coordinated their actions with a simple desire to confuse, no one realized what really was happening until one day when Santa Sofia de la Piedad gave one of them a glass of lemonade, and as soon as he tasted it, the other one said that it needed sugar. They have like a, what they call a telepathic link. Who's the dad, by the way? Aureliano? The Aurelianos? No, it was Arcadio. Yeah, he's died so long ago that I've practically forgotten. And that will be Arcadio Jr. Jose Arcadio Sr. also died, I believe, 3 chapters ago or so. Can't really remember that either. Santa Sofia de la Piedad, who had indeed forgotten to put sugar in the lemonade, told Ursula about it. That's what they're all like, she said without surprise. Crazy from birth. In time, things became less disordered. The one who came out of the game of confusion with the name of Aureliano Segundo grew to monumental size, like his grandfather's. The one who kept the name Jose Arcadio Segundo grew to be bony like the Colonel. The only thing they had in common was the family's solitary heir. So it's like they actually became each other. Yeah, the Aureliano Segundo, who's actually Arcadio Segundo, became like the Arcadios. And Jose Arcadio Segundo became more like their the one with that received that name is in reality Aureliano Segundo. Again, I don't know what like Gabriel Garcia Marquez is trying to do with all these names and confusion, but it does make it confusing. Even in the book, they have a hard time keeping track of who's who because of all these names. It's like confused lineages, as I mentioned before, and mistaken identities. It's like, who are you? Who am I? What is it? Like what's my name? Who am I? Like every character is like constantly having an existential crisis throughout the whole novel because no one seems to know how to name anyone anything other than their own name. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, and while it's true the uh, names cause confusion and a lack of meaning, at the same time they also do have meaning, because all the characters with the name Arcadio are the same way, all the characters with the name Aureliano are the same way. I still haven't figured out the connection between Remedios the Beauty and the original Remedios. My belief is that the reason she's called that is because her physical beauty matches the inner beauty of the original Remedios. I think that's why that is. And there still is only one Ursula, too. Like, Remedios the Beauty was going to be named Ursula, but then she's actually named Remedios. To fall in line with the wishes of Arcadio on his deathbed, but I think Arcadio, again, his confused lineage, like, he's naming his daughter after someone he's not related to, when I think he wanted to do the opposite. On his deathbed, it's like he was forgetting, like, who he was a descendant of. Perhaps it was that crossing of stature, names, and character that made Ursula suspect that they had been shuffled like a deck of cards since childhood. The decisive difference was revealed in the midst of the war, when Jose Arcadio Segundo asked Colonel Hernaldo Marquez to let him see an execution. Against Ursula's better judgment, his wishes were satisfied. Aureliano Segundo, on the other hand, shuddered at the mere idea of witnessing an execution. He preferred to stay home. Okay, now I'm actually confused, because I thought that they switched names, but now it's like it's not the case. Like, Jose Arcadio Segundo is acting like an Arcadio. So maybe they did switch names and their behavior changes as a result of the name switch. Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think about it too much. He preferred to stay home. At the age of 12, he asked Ursula what was in the locker room. Papers, she answered. Milcade's books and the strange things that he wrote in his last years. Instead of calming him, the answer increased his curiosity. He demanded so much, promised with such insistence that he would not mistreat the things, that Ursula gave him the keys. No one had gone into the room again since they had taken Milcade's body out, and had put on the door a padlock whose parts had become fused together with rust. When Aureliano Segundo opened the windows, a familiar light entered that seemed accustomed to lighting the room every day, and there was not the slightest trace of dust nor cobwebs. With everything swept and clean, better swept and cleaner than on the day of the burial. The ink had not dried up in the inkwell, nor had oxidation diminished the shine of the metals, nor had the embers gone out under the water pipe where Jose Arcadio Buendia had vaporized mercury. On the shelves were the books bound in a cardboard-like material, pale like tanned human skin. The manuscripts were intact. It's like everything is like untouched by age. Much like Milcade's himself. Like he just keeps coming back from the dead. He is like everlasting. Milcade's is also another one of the characters in the book that has no other Milcade's. Like he is the only Milcade's. Visitacion is the only Visitacion. Rebecca is the only Rebecca. Like everyone who's not, everyone in the book who is lucky enough to not be a Buendia gets to have their own name. Like Hernaldo Marquez. Okay. Let's see. Vapors with mercury. The air seemed fresher than the rest of the house, in spite of having been shut out for many years. Everything was so recent that several weeks later, when Ursula went into the room with a pail of water and a brush to wash the floor, there was nothing for her to do. Aureliano Segundo was deep in the reading of a book. Although it had no cover and the title did not appear anywhere, the boy enjoyed the story of a woman who sat at a table and ate nothing but kernels of rice, which she picked up with a pin, and the story of the fisherman who borrowed a weight for his net from a neighbor. When he gave him a fish in payment later, it had a diamond in its stomach. The one about the lamp that fulfilled wishes about flying carpets. Surprised, he asked Ursula if all that was true, and she answered him that it was. That many years ago, the gypsies had brought magic lamps and flying mats to Macondo. What's happening, she sighed, is that the world is slowly coming to an end and those things don't come here anymore. When he finished the book, in which many of the stories had no endings because there were pages missing, Aureliano Segundo set about deciphering the manuscripts. It was impossible. The letters looked like clothes hung out to dry on a line, and they looked more like musical notation than writing. One hot noontime, while he was poring over the manuscripts, he sensed that he was not alone in the room. Against the light from the window, sitting with his hands on his knees, was Milkyades. Aha, Milkyades finally came back. Like a boomerang, he just keeps coming back. He was under 40 years of age. He was wearing the same old-fashioned vest and hat that looked like a raven's wings. Across his pale temples there flowed the grease from his hair that had been melted by the heat, just as Aureliano and Jose Arcadio had seen him when they were children. Aureliano Segundo recognized him at once, because that hereditary memory had been transmitted from generation to generation and had come to him through the memory of his grandfather. Much like Assassin's Creed. It's like the memory passes on through the bloodline. Yeah, pretty interesting. I think there's a specific name for that phenomenon, but I can't remember what it is. Hello, Aureliano Segundo said. Hello, young man, said Milkyades. From then on, for several years, they saw each other almost every afternoon. Milkyades talked to him about the world, tried to infuse him with his old wisdom, but he refused to translate the manuscripts. No one must know their meaning until he's reached 100 years of age, he explained. Aureliano kept those meetings secret forever. On one occasion, he felt that his private world had fallen apart because Ursula came in when Milkyades was in the room, but she did not see him. Who are you talking to? She asked him. Nobody, Aureliano Segundo said. Was he a figment of Aureliano Segundo's imagination then? I don't know. That's what your great grandfather did, Ursula said. He used to talk to himself too. Yeah, either they're imagining things, or Ursula can't see what they see. One of the two is true. Jose Arcadio Segundo, in the meantime, had satisfied his wish to see a shooting. For the rest of his life, he would remember the livid flash of the 6 simultaneous shots and the echo of the discharge as it broke against the hills and the sad smile and perplexed eyes of the man being shot, who stood erect while his shirt became soaked with blood, who was still smiling even when they untied him from the post and put him in a box filled with quicklime. He's alive, he thought. They're going to bury him alive. It made such an impression on him that from then on he detested military practices and war, not because of the executions, but because of the horrifying custom of burying victims alive. How did he survive that? No one knew then exactly when he began to ring the bells in the church tower and assist Father Antonio Isabel, the successor to the Pope, at Mass and take care of the fighting cocks in the courtyard of the parish house. When Colonel Hernaldo Marquez found out, he scolded him strongly for learning occupations repudiated by the liberals. The fact is, he answered, I think I've turned out to be a conservative. He believed it as if it had been determined by fate. Colonel Hernaldo Marquez, scandalized, told Ursula about it. It's better that way, she approved. Let's hope that he becomes a priest so that God will finally come into this house. With a name like Arcadio, I doubt it. He soon discovered that Father Antonio Isabel was preparing him for his first communion. He was teaching him the catechism as he shaved the necks of his roosters. He explained to him with simple examples, as he put the brooding hens into their nests, how it had occurred to God on the second day of creation that chickens would be formed inside of an egg. From that time on, the parish priest began to show the signs of senility that would lead him to say years later that the devil had probably won his rebellion against God, that he was the one who sat on the heavenly throne, without revealing his true identity in order to trap the unwary. Wouldn't that be a twist? Warmed up by his persistence of his mentor, in a few months, Jose Arcadio Segundo came to be adept in theological tricks, used to confuse the devil as he was skilled in the tricks of the cockpit. Yeah, I think that might have reminded me of something, but I'm not sure. I can't remember what. Practically any any piece of media in which the devil's the good guy, pretty much. I just can't think of any good examples right now. Most of the time, he's a bad guy. Imranson made him a linen suit with a collar and tie, bought him a pair of white shoes, and engraved his name in gilt letters on the ribbon of the candle. 2 nights before the First Communion, Father Antonio Isabel closeted himself with him in the sacristy to hear his confession with the help of a dictionary of sins. It was such a long list that the aged priest, used to going to bed at 6 o'clock, fell asleep in his chair before it was over. The interrogation was a revelation for Jose Arcadio Segundo. It did not surprise him that the priest asked him if he had done bad things with women, and he honestly answered no. He was upset with the question as to whether he had done them with animals. Why? First Friday in May, he received communion tortured by curiosity. Later on, he asked Petronio, the sickly sexton who lived in the belfry and who, according to what they said, fed himself on bats, about it. Petronio answered him, "There are some corrupt Christians who do their business with female donkeys." Okay. Jose Arcadio Segundo still showed so much curiosity and asked so many questions that Petronio lost his patience. "I go Tuesday nights," he confessed. "If you promise not to tell anyone, I'll take you next Tuesday." Indeed, on the following Tuesday, Petronio came down out of the tower with a wooden stool, which until then no one had known of the use of, and he took Jose Arcadio Segundo to a nearby pasture. The boy became so taken with those nocturnal raids that it was a long time before he was seen at Catarino's. He became a cockfight man. "Take those creatures somewhere else," Ursula ordered him the first time she saw him in with his fine fighting birds. "Roosters have already brought too much bitterness to this house for you to bring us any more." Yeah, I don't know what she means by that. Like, I think this is the first instance I can recall of there being roosters in the house at all. So unless she's referring to them as a metaphor, I don't know what she means. Jose Arcadio Segundo took them away without any argument, but he continued breeding them at the house of Pilar Ternera, his grandmother, who gave him everything he needed in exchange for having him in her house. He soon displayed in the cockpit the wisdom that Father Antonio Isabel had given him, and he made enough money not only to enrich his brood, but also to look for a man's satisfactions. Ursula compared him with his brother at that time, could not understand how the twins, who looked like the same person in childhood, had ended up so differently. Her perplexity did not last very long. But quite soon, Aureliano Segundo began to show signs of laziness and dissipation. While he was shut up in Melquiades' room, he was drawn into himself, the way Colonel Aureliano Buendia had been in his youth. A short time after the Treaty of Neerlandia, a piece of chance took him out of his withdrawn self and made him face the reality of the world. Again, history repeating itself. Aureliano starts fighting in battles in the war. He stops creating things and writing poetry, and he goes out and starts fighting in battles. And now it's happening with Aureliano Segundo now. Expect Aureliano Segundo to start fighting in the war, fighting in battles. A young woman who was selling numbers for the raffle of an accordion greeted him with a great deal of familiarity. Aureliano Segundo was not surprised, for he was frequently confused with his brother. But he did not clear up the mistake, not even when the girl tried to soften his heart with sobs. She ended up taking him to her room. She liked him so much from that first meeting that she fixed things so that he would win the accordion in the raffle. At the end of 2 weeks, Aureliano Segundo realized that the woman had been going to bed alternately with him and his brother, thinking that they were the same man, and instead of making things clear, he arranged to prolong the situation. Especially since you know, like, if you didn't know, that'd be one thing, but kissing cousins. Yuck. He did not return to Melquiades' room. He would spend his afternoons in the courtyard, learning to play the accordion by ear over the protests of Ursula, who at the time had forbidden music in the house because of the mourning, and who, in addition, despised the accordion as an instrument, worthy only of the vagabond airs of Francisco the Man. Okay. Nevertheless, Aureliano Segundo became a virtuoso on the accordion, and he still was after he had married and had children and was one of the most respected men in Macondo. Okay. For almost 2 months he shared the woman with his brother. He would watch him, mix up his plans, and when he was sure that Jose Arcadio Segundo was not going to visit their common mistress, that night would go and sleep with her. Again, why? One morning he found that he was sick. 2 days later he found his brother clinging to a beam in the bathroom, soaked in sweat and with tears pouring down, and then he understood. His brother confessed to him that the woman had sent him away because he had given her what she called a low-life sickness. He also told him how Pilar Ternera had tried to cure him. Aureliano Segundo submitted secretly to the burning baths of permanganate into diuretic waters. Both were cured separately after 3 months of secret suffering. Jose Arcadio Segundo did not see the woman again. Aureliano Segundo obtained her pardon and stayed with her until his death. Okay. Her name was Petra Cotes. She had arrived in Macondo in the middle of the war with a chance husband who lived off raffles. When the man died, she kept up the business. She was a clean young mulatto woman with yellow almond-shaped eyes that gave her face the ferocity of a panther. But she had a generous heart and a magnificent vocation for love. When Ursula realized that Jose Arcadio Segundo was a cockfat man, that Aureliano Segundo played the accordion at his concubine's noisy parties, she thought she would go mad with the combination. It's as if the defects of the family and none of the virtues have been concentrated in both. And she decided that no one would again be called Aureliano or Jose Arcadio. It's about dang time, Ursula. It's about dang time. When Aureliano Segundo had his first son, she did not dare go against his will. What's the point of making a vow if you're not going to stick to your word? I don't know. She's like, you know what, from now on, this is how it's going to be. As a matter of fact, alright, Ursula said, but on one condition. I will bring him up. Although she was already 100 years old and on the point of going blind from cataracts, she still had her physical dynamism, her integrity of character, and her mental balance intact. No one would be better able than she to shape the virtuous man who would restore the prestige of the family. A man who would never have heard talk of war, fighting cocks, bad women, or wild undertakings. 4 calamities that, according to what Ursula thought, had determined the downfall of their line. She really thinks she's going to be able to do that? Blind? Okay. This one will be a priest, she promised solemnly. And if God gives me life, he'll be pope someday. They all laughed when they heard her, not only in the bedroom, but all through the house, where Aureliano Segundo's rowdy friends were gathered. The war, relegated to the attic of bad memories, was momentarily recalled with the popping of champagne bottles. To the health of the Pope, Aureliano Segundo toasted. The guests toasted in a chorus. Then the man of the house played the accordion, fireworks were sent off, drums celebrated the event throughout the town. At dawn, the guests, soaked in champagne, sacrificed 6 cows and put them in the street at the disposal of the crowd. No one was scandalized. Since Aureliano Segundo had taken charge of the house, those festivities were a common thing, even when there was no motive as proper as the birth of a pope. In a few years, without effort, simply by luck, he had accumulated one of the largest fortunes in the swamp, thanks to the supernatural proliferation of his animals. His mares would bear triplets, his hens laid twice a day. His hogs fattened with such speed that no one could explain such disorderly fecundity, except through the use of black magic. Save something now, Ursula would tell her great-grandson. The luck is not going to last all your life. But Aureliano Segundo paid no attention to her. The more he opened champagne to soak his friends, the more wildly his animals gave birth, the more he was convinced that his lucky star was not a matter of his conduct, but an influence of Petra Cotes, his concubine, whose love had the virtue of exasperating nature. So convinced was he that this was the origin of his fortune, that he never kept Petra Cotes far away from his breeding grounds, and even when he married and had children, he continued living with her with the consent of Fernanda. Solid, monumental like his grandfather's, but with the joie de vivre and irresistible good humor that they did not have, Aureliano Segundo scarcely had time to look after his animals. All he had to do was take Petra Cotes to his breeding grounds and have her ride across his land, in order to have every animal marked with his brand, succumb to the irremediable plague of proliferation. Well, like all good things, they must end. Like all good things that occurred in his long life, that tremendous fortune had its origins in chance. Till the end of the wars, Petra Cortez continued to support herself with the returns from her raffles, and Aureliano Segundo was able to sack Ursula's savings from time to time. They were a frivolous couple, with no other worries except going to bed every night, even on forbidden days, and frolicking there until dawn. That woman has always been your ruination, Ursula would shout at her great-grandson when she saw him coming into the house like a sleepwalker. Yeah, I guess it is her great-grandson. Well, good. She's got you so bewitched. Like she's been alive for so long. There's been like 5 or 6 generations. She's got you so bewitched that one of these days I'm going to see you twisting around with colic, with a toad in your belly. Jose Arcadio Segundo, who took a long time to discover that he had been supplanted, and was unable to understand his brother's passion. He remembered Petra Cortez as an ordinary woman, rather lazy in bed, completely lacking in any resources for lovemaking. Deaf to Ursula's clamor and the teasing of his brother, Aureliano Segundo only thought at that time of finding a trade that would allow him to maintain a house for Petra Cortez, to die with her, on top of her and underneath her, during a night of feverish license. Colonel Aureliano Buendia opened up his workshop again, seduced at last by the peaceful charms of old age. Aureliano Segundo thought that it would be a good business to devote himself to the manufacture of little goldfishes. He spent many hours in the hot room watching how the hard sheets of metal, worked by the colonel with the inconceivable patience of disillusionment, were slowly being converted into golden scales. The work seemed so laborious to him that the thought of Petra Cortez was so persistent and pressing that after 3 weeks he disappeared from the workshop. It was during that time that it occurred to Petra Cortez to raffle off the rabbits. They reproduced and grew up so fast, there was barely time to sell the tickets for the raffle. First, Aureliano Segundo did not notice the alarming proportions of the proliferation. But one night, when nobody in town wanted to hear about the rabbit raffle anymore, he heard a noise by the courtyard door. "Don't get worried," Petra Cortez said. "It's only the rabbits." He could not sleep, tormented by the uproar of the animals. At dawn, Aureliano Segundo opened the door and saw the courtyard paved with rabbits, blue in the glow of dawn. Petra Cortez, dying with laughter, could not resist the temptation of teasing him. "Those are the ones who were born last night," she said. "Oh my God," he said. "Why don't you raffle off cows?" A few days later, in an attempt to clean out her courtyard, Petra Cortez exchanged the rabbits for a cow, who 2 months later gave birth to triplets. That was how things began. Overnight, Aureliano Segundo became the owner of the land and livestock, and he barely had time to enlarge his overflowing barns and pig pens. It was a delirious prosperity that even made him laugh. He could not help doing crazy things to release his good humor. "Cease, cows, life is short," he would shout. Ursula wondered what entanglements he had gone into, whether he might be stealing, whether he'd become a rustler. And every time she saw him uncorking champagne just for the pleasure of pouring the foam over his head, she would shout at him and scold him for the waste. It annoyed him so much that one day when he awoke in a merry mood, Aureliano Segundo appeared with a chest full of money, a can of paste, and a brush, singing at the top of his lungs the old songs of Francisco the Man. He papered the house inside and out, from top to bottom, with 1 peso banknotes. The old mansion, painted white since the time they had brought the pianola, took on the strange look of a mosque. In the midst of the excitement of the family, the scandalization of Ursula, the joy of the people cramming the street to watch that apotheosis of squandering. Aureliano Segundo finished by papering the house from the front to the kitchen, including the bathrooms and bedrooms, and threw the leftover bills into the courtyard. "Now," he said in a final way, "I hope that nobody in this house ever talks to me about money again." Yeah, very funny. Very funny. That was what happened. Ursula had the bills taken down, stuck to great cakes of whitewash, and the house was painted white again. "Dear Lord," she begged, "make us poor again, the way we were when we founded this town, so that you will not collect for this squandering in the other life." Her prayers were answered in reverse. The Lord works in mysterious ways sometimes. One of the workmen removed the bills and bumped into an enormous plaster statue of St. Joseph that someone had left in the house during the last years of the war. And the hollow figure broke to pieces on the floor. It had been stuffed with gold coins. No one could remember who had brought that life-size saint. 3 men brought it, Amarantha explained. They asked us to keep it until the rains were over, and I told them to put it there in the corner where nobody would bump into it. There they put it, very carefully, and there it's been ever since because they never came back for it. Later on, Ursula had put the candles on it and had prostrated herself before it, not suspecting that instead of a saint, she was adoring almost 400 pounds of gold. The tardy evidence of her involuntary paganism made her even more upset. Yeah, something about religion and money just do not mix at all. She spat on the spectacular pile of coins, put them in 3 canvas sacks, buried them in a secret place, hoping that sooner or later the 3 unknown men would come to reclaim them. Much later, during the difficult years of her decrepitude, Ursula would intervene in the conversations of the many travelers who came by the house at that time, asked if they had left a plaster of St. Joseph there during the war to be taken care of until the rains passed. She's like, you haven't left a giant statue of St. Joseph here, have you? You would have happened to have, just left a statue of a saint here filled with money, by any chance, would you have? She says with cataracts in her eyes, slowly disintegrating from old age. Things like that, which Ursula gave such consternation, were commonplace in those days. Macondo was swamped in miraculous prosperity. The adobe houses of the founders had been replaced by brick buildings with wooden blinds and cement floors, which made the suffocating heat of 2 o'clock in the afternoon more bearable. All that remained at that time, Jose Arcadio Buendia's ancient village, were the dusty almond trees, destined to resist the most arduous of circumstances. The river of clear water, whose prehistoric stones had been pulverized by the frantic hammers of Jose Arcadio II when he set about opening the channel in order to establish a boat line. It was a maddening, comparable to those of his great-grandfather, for the rocky riverbed and the numerous rapids prevented navigation from Macondo to the sea. But Jose Arcadio II, in an unforeseen burst of temerity, stubbornly kept on with the project. Until then he had showed no signs of imagination. Except for his precarious adventure with Petra Cortes, he had never known a woman. Ursula had considered him the quietest example the family had ever produced in all its history, incapable of standing out even as a handler of fighting cocks. When Colonel Aureliano Buendia told him the story of the Spanish galleon aground 8 miles from the sea, the carbonized frame from which he had seen himself during the war, the story which for so many years had seemed fantastic to so many people was a revelation for Jose Arcadio II. He auctioned off his roosters to the highest bidder, recruited men, bought tools, set about the awesome task of breaking stones, digging canals, clearing away rapids, even harnessing waterfalls. I know all of this by heart, Ursula would shout. It's as if time had turned around and we were back at the beginning. Much like Melchiades, it all just starts over again. When he thought that the river was navigable, Jose Arcadio II gave his brother a detailed account of his plans, later gave him the money he needed for the enterprise. He disappeared for a long time. It had been said that his plan to buy a boat was nothing but a trick to make off with his brother's money, when the news spread that a strange craft was approaching the town. He's like, I'm starting a boat business, and his brother's like, he's like enough money to spread it around the house, and he's like, cows, they have like, the kid, like, just keep having other cows, rabbits keep having other rabbits. He's like, I just so happen to be starting a boat business. The inhabitants of Macondo, who no longer remembered the colossal undertakings of Jose Arcadio Buendia, ran to the riverbank, saw with eyes popping in disbelief the arrival of the first and last boat ever to dock in the town. It was nothing but a log raft drawn by thick ropes, pulled by 20 men who walked along the bank. In the prow, with a glow of satisfaction in his eyes, Jose Arcadio II was directing the arduous maneuver. There ride with him a rich group of splendid matrons who were protecting themselves from the burning sun with gaudy parasols, wore on their shoulders fine silk kerchiefs, with colored creams on their faces and natural flowers in their hair, golden serpents on their arms and diamonds in their teeth. Yeah, get real. You want to see my what? The log raft was the only vessel that Jose Arcadio II was able to bring to Macondo. Only once. But he never recognized the failure of his enterprise, but proclaimed his deed as a victory of willpower. I'll say so, like, if that's the first boat to ever dock in Macondo, like, even that is a triumph. He gave a scrupulous accounting to his brother and very soon plunged into the routine cockfights. The only thing that remained of that unfortunate venture was the breath of renovation that the matrons from France brought, as their magnificent arts transformed traditional methods of love and their sense of social well-being, abolished Caterino's antiquated place, and turned the street into a bazaar of Japanese lanterns and nostalgic hand organs. They were the promoters of the bloody carnival that plunged Macondo into delirium for 3 days, whose only lasting consequence was having given Aureliano Segundo the opportunity to meet Fernanda del Carpio. Which will become his wife, as I believe. Let's check the chart. Yes. Okay. She knows. And I wonder if Remedios, the beauty, I think, is like the spiritual descendant of Amaranta. She rebukes her suitor, so he kills himself, much like Amaranta did before. I wonder why she wasn't named Amaranta then. I don't know. Amaranta the second. Let's see. Remedios the Beauty was proclaimed queen. Ursula, who shuddered at the disquieting beauty of her great-granddaughter, could not prevent the choice. Until then, she had succeeded in keeping her off the streets unless it was to go to mass with Amaranta. But she made her cover her face with a black shawl. She has to cover herself because she's too beautiful. Everyone who sees her just, like, wants to have her. The most impious men, those who would disguise themselves as priests to say sacrilegious masses in Caterino's store, would go to church with an aim to see, if only for an instant, the face of Remedios the Beauty, whose legendary good looks were spoken of with an alarming excitement throughout the swamp. It was a long time before they were able to do so, and it would have been better for them if they never had, because most of them never recovered their peaceful habits of sleep. The man who made it possible, a foreigner, lost his serenity forever, became involved in the sloughs of abjection and misery. Years later was cut to pieces by a train after he'd fallen asleep on the tracks. From the moment he was seen in the church, wearing a green velvet suit and an embroidered vest, no one doubted that he came from far away, perhaps from some distant city outside of the country, attracted by the magical fascination of Remedios the Beauty. He was so handsome, so elegant and dignified, with such presence that Pietro Crispi would have been a mere fop beside him. Many women whispered with spiteful smiles that he was the one who really should have worn the shawl. He did not speak to anyone in Macondo. He appeared at dawn on Sunday like a prince in a fairy tale, riding a horse with silver stirrups and a velvet blanket, and he left town after Mass. Yeah, he's not named, interestingly. He's just the man. The power of his presence was such that from the first time he was seen in the church, everybody took it for granted that a silent, intense duel had been established between him and Remedios the Beauty, a secret pact, an irrevocable challenge that would end not only in love, but also in death. On the sixth Sunday, the gentleman appeared with a yellow rose in his hand. Yellow roses, evocative of, I believe, Jose Arcadia Buendia. Like, that's his flower. Yeah. He heard Mass standing, as he always did, and at the end, he stepped in front of Remedios the Beauty and offered her the solitary rose. She took it with a natural gesture, as if she had been prepared for that homage, when she uncovered her face and gave her thanks with a smile. That was all she did. Not only for the gentleman, but for all the men who had the unfortunate privilege of seeing her. That was an eternal instant. And that's an oxymoronic statement, an oxymoronic phrase. From then on, the gentleman had a band of musicians play beside the window of Remedios the Beauty, sometimes until dawn. Like a bunch of mariachis just outside her door. Ay, 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 ay. She's like, thank you very much. Really, the mariachi. Aureliano Segundo was the only one who felt a cordial compassion for him, and he tried to break his perseverance. Yeah, I wonder why. waste your time anymore, he told him one night. The women in this house are worse than mules. Yeah, actually, really could have been named Amaranta the Second. He offered him his friendship, invited him to bathe in champagne. He's like, he's like, take a champagne shower. It's fine. It's what we do in this house. Tried to make him understand that the females of his family had insides made of flint, but he could not weaken his obstinacy. Exasperated by the interminable nights of music, Colonel Aureliano Buendia threatened to cure his affliction with a few pistol shots. Nothing made him desist except his own lamentable state of demoralization. From a well-dressed and neat individual, he became filthy and ragged. It was rumored that he had abandoned power and fortune in his distant nation, although his origins were actually never known. He originated from Ursula and Jose Arcadio Buendia. Like, he was their first son. What do you mean his origins were known? Like, they are known. He became argumentative, a barroom brawler. He will wake up rolling in his own filth in Caterino's store. The saddest part of his drama was that Remedios the Beauty did not notice him. Oh, is this the guy? Yeah, I thought this was referring to Colonel Aureliano Buendia because he's mentioned in the preceding sentence, but I believe it's actually the guy who's trying to get with Remedios. Yeah, it seems like this is all talking about Colonel Aureliano Buendia, because all of those statements follow from the first sentence, so I don't know, maybe it's just confusing writing. I don't know. Right? Like, why would Colonel Aureliano Buendia be trying to win the affections of Remedios? That's his great niece, I think. Is who she actually is to him. His great niece, I believe. Great niece, I believe. Yeah, she did not notice him, even when he was dressed in church like a prince. She accepted the yellow rose without the least bit of malice, amused rather by the extravagance of the act. She lifted her shawl to see his face better, not to show hers. Actually, Remedios the Beauty was not a creature of this world. Till she was well along in puberty, Santa Sofia de la Piedad had to bathe and dress her. Even when she could take care of herself, it was necessary to keep an eye on her so that she would not paint little animals on the walls with a stick, daubed in her own excrement. What? She reached 20 without knowing how to read or write, unable to use the silver at the table, wandering naked through the house because her nature rejected all manner of convention. Again, okay. When the young commander of the guard declared his love for her, she rejected him simply because his frivolity startles her. See how simple he is, she told Amaranta. He says that he's dying because of me, as if I were a bad case of colic. When indeed they found him dead beside her window, Remedios the Beauty confirmed her first impression. You see, she commented, he was a complete simpleton. It seemed as if some penetrating lucidity permitted her to see the reality of things beyond any formalism. That at least was the point of view of Colonel Aureliano Buendia, for whom Remedios the Beauty was in no way mentally retarded, as was generally believed, but quite the opposite. She was so smart that she had no need for clothes. They simply were unnecessary in her level of understanding. She evolved to the next step. It's as if she's come back from 20 years of war, he would say. Ursula, for her part, thanked God for having awarded the family with a creature of exceptional purity. But at the same time, she was disturbed by her beauty, for it seemed a contradictory virtue to her, a diabolical trap at the center of her innocence. It was for that reason she decided to keep her away from the world, to protect her from all earthly temptation, not knowing that Remedios the Beauty, even from the time when she was in her mother's womb, was safe from any contagion. It never entered her head that they would elect her beauty queen of the carnival pandemonium. But Aureliano II, excited at the caprice of disguising himself as a tiger, brought Father Antonio Isabel to the house in order to convince Ursula that the carnival was not a pagan feast, as she said, but a Catholic tradition. Finally convinced, even though reluctantly, she consented to the coronation. The news that Remedios Buendia was going to be the sovereign ruler of the festival was beyond the limits of the swamp in a few hours. Reached distant places where the prestige of her beauty was not known, and it aroused the anxiety of those who still thought of her last name as a symbol of subversion. The anxiety was baseless. If anyone had become harmless at that time, it was the aging and disillusioned Colonel Aureliano Buendia, who was slowly losing all contact with the reality of the nation. Yeah, it's amazing how many times he has not died. Like he was like put up against the firing, like he was said to be executed. He shot himself in the chest. He, escaped. I don't know how many assassination attempts. Closed in his workshop, his only relationship with the rest of the world was his business and little goldfishes. One of the soldiers who had guarded his house during the first days of peace would go seldom in the village of the swamp, return loaded down with coins and news. That the conservative government, he would say, with the backing of the liberals, was reforming the calendar so that every president could remain in power for 100 years. That's the concordat with the Holy See had finally been signed, and a cardinal had come from Rome with a crown of diamonds and a throne of solid gold, and that the liberal ministers had their pictures taken on their knees in an act of kissing his ring. That the leading lady of the Spanish company passing through the capital had been kidnapped by a band of masked highwaymen. And on the following Sunday, she had danced in the nude at the summer house of the President of the Republic. Don't talk to me about politics, the colonel would tell him. Our business is selling little fishes. He's like, I've had enough of the war. We're shrimp business now. Shrimp, gumbo shrimp. Coconut shrimp. Shrimp on the Barbie. All we do is sell shrimp now. We don't even talk about the war anymore. Remember that he did not want to hear anything about the situation in the country because he was growing rich in his workshop made Ursula laugh when it reached her ears. With her terrible practical sense, she could not understand the colonel's business as he exchanged little fishes for gold coins and then converted the coins into little fishes and so on, with the result that he had to work all the harder with the more he sold in order to satisfy an exasperating vicious circle. Yes, it happens in real life, too. It's like we sell cars to make money, and then we use the money to make cars, and then we sell cars to make money, and then we use the money to make more cars, and I'm sure some CEOs probably feel like this sometimes. It's like, actually, like, we're in a vicious cycle of capitalism. How do I get off? Actually, what interested him was not the business, but the work. He needed so much concentration to link scales, fit minute rubies into the eyes, laminate gills, and put on fins that there was not the smallest empty moment left for him to fill with his disillusionment of the war. So absorbing was the attention required by the delicacy of his artistry that in a short time he had aged more than during all the years of the war. His position had twisted his spine, and the close work he had used up all of his eyesight, but the implacable concentration awarded him with a peace of spirit. The last time he was seen to take an interest in some matter related to the war was when a group of veterans from both parties sought his support for the approval of lifetime pensions, which had always been promised and were always about to be put into effect. Forget about it, he told them. You can see how I refused my pension in order to get rid of the torture of waiting for it until the day I died. What's the point of a pension if you don't get it until after you die? What will be the point? At first, Colonel Hernaldo Marquez would visit him at dusk. They would both sit in the street door and talk about the past. But Amaranta could not bear the memories of that man. That man whose baldness had plunged him into the abyss of premature old age. But aroused in her, she would torment him with snide remarks until he did not come back except on special occasions. And he finally disappeared, extinguished by paralysis. Oh, Amaranta. She's another character that just will not die. And I like to believe it's because she sustains herself through the suffering of others. Like, your tragedy keeps me alive. Let's see, where am I? Paralysis. Kaz turned silent, insensible to the new breath of vitality that was shaking the house. Colonel Leon Buendia could understand only that the secret of good old age is simply an honorable pact with solitude. Yeah, I've got that down. There's one thing I've got down, is that he would get up at 5 in the morning after a light sleep, have his eternal mug of bitter coffee in the kitchen, shut himself up all day in the workshop. 4 in the afternoon, he would go along the porch dragging a stool, not even noticing the fire of the rose bushes on the brightness of the hour of the persistence of Amaranta, whose melancholy made the noise of a boiling pot, which was perfectly perceptible at dusk. He would sit in the street door as long as the mosquitoes would allow him to. Someone dared to disturb his solitude once. "How are you, Colonel?" he asked in passing. "Right here," he answered, "waiting for my funeral procession to pass." So that the anxiety caused by the public reappearance of his family name, having to do with the coronation of Remedios the Beauty, was baseless. Many people did not think that way, however. Innocent of the tragedy that threatened it, the town poured into the main square in a noisy explosion of merriment. The carnival had reached its highest level of madness, and Aureliano Segundo had satisfied at last his dream of dressing up like a tiger and was walking along the wild throng, hoarse from so much roaring, when on the swamp road a parade of several people appeared carrying in a gilded litter the most fascinating women that imagination could conceive. For a moment the inhabitants of Macondo took off their masks in order to get a better look at the dazzling creature with a crown of emeralds and an ermine cape, who seemed invested with legitimate authority, was not merely a sovereign of bangles and crepe paper. There were many people who had sufficient insight to suspect that it was a question of provocation. But Aureliano Segundo immediately conquered his perplexity, and declared the new arrivals to be guests of honor. With the wisdom of Solomon, he created Remedios the Beauty and the intruding queen on the same day. Till midnight, the strangers, disguised as Bedouins, took part in the delirium and even enriched it with the sumptuous fireworks and acrobatic skills that made one think of the art of gypsies. Suddenly, during the paroxysm of the celebration, someone broke the delicate balance. "Long live the Liberal Party," he shouted. "Long live Colonel Aureliano Buendia." And then all hell breaks loose. The rifle shots drowned out the splendor of the fireworks. Cries of terror drowned out the music, and joy turned into panic. Like, there's always that crazy revolutionary who's like, "Long live la revolution!" The revolution is never truly over. Many years later, there were those who still insisted that the royal guard of the intruding queen was a squad of regular army soldiers who were concealing government-issued rifles under their rich Moorish robes. The government denied the charge in a special proclamation and promised a complete investigation of the bloody episode. The truth never came to light, and the version always prevailed that the royal guard, without provocation of any kind, took up combat positions upon a signal from their commander, and opened fire without pity on the crowd. When calm was restored, not one of the false Bedouins remained in town, and there were many dead and wounded lying on the square. 9 clowns, 4 columbines, 17 playing card kings, 1 devil, 3 minstrels, 2 peers of France, 3 Japanese empresses, In the confusion of the panic, Jose Arcadio II managed to rescue Remedios the Beauty, and Aureliano II carried the intruding queen to the house in his arms, her dress torn and the ermine cape stained with blood. Her name was Fernanda del Carpio. Okay, so that's his wife now. She had been chosen as the most beautiful of the 5,000 most beautiful women in the land. They brought her to Macondo with the promise of naming her Queen of Madagascar. Ursula took care of her as if she were her own daughter. The town, instead of doubting her innocence, pitied her candor. 6 months after the massacre, when the wounded had recovered and the last flowers on the mass grave had withered, Aureliano II went to fetch her from the distant city where she lived with her father, and he married her in Macondo with a noisy celebration that lasted 20 days. Yeah, wow. And meanwhile, Colonel Aureliano Buendia is there like, he's like, I'm just going to keep making these goldfishes. I don't want to hear anything more about war, revolutions, the new way change. I don't want to hear about any of that. I just want to make my goldfishes. That's all I want to do. That's all I want to worry about. Getting these rubies in their eyes before what's left of my eyesight is gone. Putting the scales on just right. These fishes are the only thing that are real now. The only thing that matter. Nothing else. Okay, so that that was 100 Years of Solitude, Chapter 10. And thank you for watching. I'll be back with a Fallout 76 episode for the day, and that will wrap us up today's show. Thank you for watching. We'll be back soon.